Is my great pleasure. I'm Chris Hoadley. I am the director of the UB Institute for Learning Sciences, UBills, Go Bills. And I am happy to introduce our speaker for today, Charles Logan, who comes to us from Northwestern University, where he's a doctoral candidate. Charles has a history of being a classroom English teacher, he has a degree in creative writing. He studied educational technology, and now in his doctoral studies, I had to quote this one beautiful phrase he had in his biography. He analyzes how power operates through technology and works alongside teachers and students to theorize and develop ways to resist, refuse, repurpose, and reimagine technologies towards ends that center care and collective flourishing. Damn. So we are ever so lucky to have him here in Buffalo, all the way from Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Charles Logan.
Yeah. Okay, my mic is working.
Yes.
First of all, happy Pi Day, everybody. As Chris said, I was a former high school English teacher, and I wasn't often jealous of my math colleagues, except on Pi Day. Writing a sonnet about a piece of delicious pie, not nearly as tasty as actually eating the pie. The name of my talk today is, I think it's pretty helpful, but it kind of does a lot more hurt than good, how youth wrestle with generative AI's possibilities and harms. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the study, which is a study for my dissertation, and I'll end with some reflections on the moment we find ourselves in. So, it's not advancing.
Not advancing.
All right. Okay. So I've been thinking a lot about trees lately. Take this image from a news story in May of last year. The caption reads, "The Google urban forest was built about 10 miles from central Santiago to offset the air pollution caused by the company's data center. The forest is currently closed to visitors and contains mostly dry shrubs." The image of trees of mostly dry shrubs, I should correct myself here, has remained with me because I think it communicates two important ideas about big tech and AI. First, that AI's infrastructure, the data centers that help to make AI and the internet possible, have material impacts on communities in the form of depleted water supplies and air pollution. Many times, as is the case with this data center near Santiago, Chile, the communities are under-resourced and often, though not always, struggling to fight against powerful US tech companies. A second idea that this image brings up for me is the failure of big tech to deliver the promise of abundance. This branded forest, right? It's the Google urban forest, is not a forest. It's a simulacrum, a fenced-off failed promise. Oh no, it's not advancing again. Okay. I'm gonna jam in there. And then there's the charred remains of this tree burnt in fires that swept through the Los Angeles area in January. I've been thinking about this tree, of the people who lost their homes and their lives in fires that are growing more frequent and more intense because of the ongoing climate crisis. Oh, this tree, that tree. And there's also, at the same time, this mounting evidence that the growth of generative AI is contributing to climate change. From the water required to operate ChatGPT, to big tech companies burning coal to power their data centers and polluting the air. Again, as we see this headline from the Washington Post, in low-income areas, to questionable corporate climate accounting practices, the environmental harms of generative AI cannot be ignored. If folks are interested, I maintain an open library of resources, both from journalism as well as peer-reviewed research and other resources like podcasts and things like that about the environmental impacts of AI. And so that QR code will take you there. At the same time, I can't ignore that, at least according to recent Pew Research Center findings, that more young people are using generative AI tools. And Pew's findings match my own anecdotal evidence or observations teaching high school and undergraduate students. So for me, there's this fundamental tension about generative AI's harms and possibilities. And I think this is an urgent empirical question that we need to explore, especially with young people, a generation who will bear the brunt of climate disasters for years to come. So I'm curious, how do young people make sense of generative AI and its ethical dilemmas? And it was really this question that was guiding my study. So I'm going to situate my study in some literature. I'm going to be using the word critical, sort of big C critical throughout my conversation today. And I'm using it in sort of the tradition of critical pedagogy and Paulo Freire, and thinking about the ways that we attend to the ways that power operates in the world, and also in socio-technical systems as well. And so two of the bodies of literature that I'm drawing on for this study come from critical computing education. And you can think about sort of in three different buckets here of inquiry, design, and reimagination of unjust socio-technical systems. So inquiry might look like a workshop or a 6-week program that looks at the ethics of AI or other sorts of advanced technologies. Design would be designing actual artifacts or computer programs to, again, sort of examine these unjust socio-technical systems. And reimagining these systems might look like the work of Jones and Mello, colleagues of mine at Northwestern, who have developed an abolitionist computer science education program. Alongside this body of literature are critical AI literacies, and this bridge from one of your colleagues here at Buffalo thinks about sort of critical computational literacies and critical digital literacies, those are predating AI literacies. And again, both of those bodies of literature thinking about how power operates with and through technology. And then the emergence in the last year or so of different critical AI literacy frameworks, for example, the work of Dr. Tia Tanksley and her critical race algorithmic literacy framework. I'm going to draw on this literature, but the literature that I'm mostly sort of grounding my study in is platform studies in education. So we can think about platforms as different kinds of serving different kinds of purposes, from socializing and commerce to education to generative AI. And we can think about platform ecologies as constituted of social, technical, and political economic dimensions. And for me, this broadens the ethical field that we can engage young people with in terms of these really important and pressing questions as we think about learning as heterogeneous meaning-making, and also as an opportunity for sense-making about the intersections of ideology and technology. So I've told you I've been thinking a lot about trees. In part, it's in the literature. So this comes from Phil Nichols and Antero Garcia, and thinking again about if typical AI literacy maybe focus on the social, right, of content, of the outputs of ChatGPT or of DALL-E, and maybe critical computing will also look at the technical dimensions, that an affordance of an ecological approach to platforms, to generative AI, opens up this political economic dimension that I find resonates with my interests and research. And that so we see, for example, material resources as being something to investigate with young people. And that includes the environmental costs of AI infrastructure, as well as things like factory labor, how these models are trained. To give you just one sort of glimpse of an ecology of ChatGPT, we can think about it, right? We have the social, right? The interactions that are happening on the platform, the technical infrastructure, the data servers that are housed in data centers that provide the compute power for these models, and then a tiered subscription model as part of the political economic layer of platform. So again, just to take a step back, my study is sort of pulling on these different bodies of literature to inform the work. In terms of my theoretical framework, I'm using Youth as Philosophers of Technology, which is a framework that really prizes contemplation as a privileged mode of sense-making with and about technology. It's a framework that draws on both critical technology education as well as political education and the learning sciences. And it offers sort of two different affordances for me as both a pedagogical tool for design, so thinking about what sorts of ethical questions we can ask and embed in a learning environment, and then also as an analytic lens of making sense of the kinds of thinking that students are doing when engaging with these ethical questions. I'll talk about the context of the study. It's the Young People's Race, Power, and Technology Project, or YPRPT. This is a community-based social design experiment in Chicago. Over the past 5 years, we've worked with a number of high school youth, mostly from minoritized groups in Chicago and in Evanston, just north of Chicago. And broadly, we're interested in working with young people to explore, critique, and reimagine technological systems. And that's taken on different forms over the years. The first 2 years, we co-designed a curriculum with young folks, and then they produced documentaries at the end. So you see here Melting Ice. ICE is, in this case, also Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so young people were looking at the surveillance technologies that ICE were deploying in Chicago and the sorts of community responses. Youth, as I said, also developed curriculum, and a number of other artifacts have been produced over the years. I was the lead teacher of the program last summer. It was year 5 of YPRPT. Last summer, we partnered with Digital Youth Network, which is this really robust infrastructure that Dr. Nicole Pinkard has developed over time in Chicago. The site of the study was a public high school on Chicago's South Side. It was a 6-week program that met from Monday through Thursday for 4 hours a day. And there are 3 units over the course of the 6 weeks: AI in education, AI in surveillance, and AI in social media. I was not the only teacher in the space. Also, through Digital Youth Network, worked alongside 4 co-teachers, or STEAM ambassadors, as they're known. And those STEAM ambassadors were hired through, as I said, Digital Youth Network. They were college-age students who didn't necessarily have a background as teachers, but they were interested in working with young people, and they're interested in this subject. And so it was one person who identified as a Black female, 2 Latinx males, and 1 South Asian male. 11 students participated in the program. Of those 11, 6 students assented and consented to participate in the research portion. And they are 16 to 18 years old. 3 identified as Black females and 3 as Black males. To give you a sense of the curriculum for the education and AI unit, there were 5 different lessons. So starting with sort of grounding in, what is AI? How is it different than generative AI? And I acknowledge I will use these terms sort of interchangeably today, and I know that that's probably a no-no, but I'm going to do that. And so I realize for sort of it's become shorthand for lots of different technologies. So I do want to acknowledge that. And the study itself, one of the studies, a different study is focused on this speculative ed tech piece that I won't talk about today. You can read my dissertation sometime. Is this lesson on the ecologies of AI. So having sort of established with the young people about what AI is, how it's different from generative AI, looking at some, how do biases enter into these systems, we use the ecologies of AI day to sort of open up the conversation around platforms and ecological approaches to AI infrastructure and its impact and in different dimensions. So the day itself was focused on an audit of ChatGPT. And the audit I had done previously in an undergrad class that I co-designed and taught with my advisor. And it proved to be this really sort of rich conversation where we were looking at, in this case, in YPRPT, in the Young People's Race, Power, and Technology Project, 4 different dimensions across social, technical, and political economic of ChatGPT and generative AI in general. But data privacy and security, democracy, environment, and labor. I used a jigsaw puzzle approach. So the young people selected one of the dimensions that they wanted to explore more in depth. They then read or watched alongside a Steam ambassador some news stories about generative AI and its impact on their selected dimension. After that, we broke into 2 groups, and each group consisted of at least 1 member from the different dimensions. So each group consisted of someone at least who had, everybody in each of those groups could bring what they had learned and share with everybody else. Again, the jigsaw approach. And use these critical questions to really guide the conversation about sort of the ethical dilemmas, right, of ChatGPT, of generative AI. And it was that conversation that I recorded, and that consists of the data that I analyzed for the study. It was an hour-long and change conversation. So as I was thinking and approaching this data, my 2 research questions were as follows. 1, what kinds of critical analysis of generative AI's ecologies did a philosophical inquiry open for students? And 2, what types of relationships inform students' sense-making about generative AI while completing a philosophical inquiry? The analytical methods I used, first was producing the transcript and using discourse analysis methods in 2 cycles of coding. My first cycle of coding, I used deductive topic coding based on my research questions. So there's really 2 topic codes. One was the types of critical analyses that students were constructing, and 2, the sorts of relationships that they were naming as they were making sense of the ethical dilemmas of generative AI. From those topic codes, and then produce inductive subcodes. And you can get a sense of those subcodes and descriptions here from sort of snapshot of my code book. And you can see that students really constructed quite a number of critical analyses of generative AI, from more sort of typical discourse you hear about cheating to things like corporate profit, data privacy and security, environment, intellectual property theft, mis and disinformation, and then working conditions. So they're using both what they had learned through the audit, but also bringing in discourse that we had been talking about prior to the audit, as well as that they had been talking about in their own school environments. In terms of the relationships that students were kind of drawing on and naming to make sense of generative AI, it was both interpersonal, so that the technology's impacts on their own cognition and their own relationship with their own thinking and learning, to interpersonal between groups of people, and then at multiple scales too, from the human to planet, from human to generative AI, from human to the tech company, and the tech company to the actual tool itself. The second then cycle of coding that I completed, I used to identify sort of 2 big subcodes that I used to analyze my data. So the sort of 2 critical analysis subcodes were big tech's mechanisms of extraction and exploitation, and then corporate washing efforts, ethics washing, greenwashing, and then the different sorts of relationships that were emerging and sort of patterns across the data. One, this tension between singularity and solidarity, corporate motivations and technology's impacts, and then accountability and what accountability might look like, and who should be held accountable for the impacts of generative AI. I'm going to talk about 2 focal students, Stephanie and Kiara. They're selected because they were quite vocal in their thinking, and so they would talk at length and offered insight then into their thinking. And so for that reason, selected them to offer as illuminating cases of how youth determined that generative AI is unethical, but also it's a little bit more complicated than just saying it's unethical, as we'll see. So now comes the fun part, which is looking at data. And I just want to sort of orient people to these next coming slides of the data. So at the top, we're going to have sort of a big sort of summary of what you're looking at. In this case, Stephanie is going to contemplate the complicated possibilities of AI and generative AI. And then on the side here, we've got some color coding of, again, those sort of second round of subcodes connected to research question 1 and research question 2. And so here we have Faith, who again is the ambassador. So back to the question, what's AI's cost? And do you think it's beneficial? Stephanie says, I don't think there's a reason why we need to use so much water. We don't need that many data servers. I don't think it just feels excessive to me. It feels like it's a money grab. Faith says, Stephanie continues, but I'm not going to deny the fact that AI has helped track deforestation and helped track marine life, and that's helped endangered animals. It's also tracked climate change, and AI has also found ways to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and help the ozone layer. Do I think they balance out, or do I think one would be a greater benefit than the other? I think it's hard to say. I don't know if they balance out. It kind of feels like they want you to say they balance out. So I think there's a lot happening here, but it's a few things to sort of highlight. One is Stephanie sort of keying in on the costs, the material costs of operating generative AI. And for her, going back to the tech companies and saying, this is excessive, it feels like a money grab. Well, at the same time, this tension of, well, this technology has, and based on what she was learning, helped track deforestation, helped track marine life. But she arrives at a point where, I interpret it, and she doesn't use this language, this is me using this language, of an example of greenwashing, of saying that here is a narrative that this technology is going to address climate change, and it might, but also at what cost? Do those impacts of generative AI outweigh the cost? And right here says, it feels like they, and I interpret they to mean the tech companies themselves, OpenAI and Google and Microsoft. She continues, and Faye says, yeah. And Stephanie says, but if you look at the now and you see people are hurt because of this development and we're hurting more people than how many people you want to save, then it's kind of like saying, oh, we'll hurt this many amount of people, but in the future, we can save the whole world. But there is no, how do I explain it? There is not a definitive answer that this is going to help in the long run. So we see her really wrestling with this uncertainty. And importantly, wrestling with this singularity and solidarity, as I interpret it, and thinking about who sort of are we committed to, the people in the present, or is there a possibility of this abstract promise that we're often sold that technology will help, untold millions, billions of people far into the future? And again, what she's naming is a very popular ideology held by very powerful people in Silicon Valley called effective altruism and long-termism. And she's naming these ideologies equipped with that language, but again, she's sort of calling bullshit on that narrative of like, this technology is going to help, we just have to give it time. And yes, people on planet are going to be hurt in the present, but it'll be worth it in the end. And so we see her doing that ethical wrestling in this moment. In this next excerpt, we see Chiara describing how big tech companies harm people and the planet and determining that ChatGPT isn't ethical. I was not an active participant in this discussion, but I did need to move the conversation along. So at points I was interjecting with the next question. And so I posed the question that we kept returning to throughout this hour and 7-minute conversation: is ChatGPT ethical? And Chiara, right, is like, no. Stephanie says, oh, they laugh. I encourage Chiara to say more. And she laughs and says, it's not ethical at all. Because they're not going into these emotions or caring about how other people feel about certain things. Like they'll steal like other people's artwork, wouldn't care. Underpaying people so they don't benefit, don't care. Taking away water from people, don't care. They don't care. They only care about what benefits the company and help them come up. And they're not going deep into how it is this affecting other people, how this is affecting the bystanders. So yeah, no, it's not ethical. And here we see Chiara weaving this really sophisticated analysis, again, across social, technical, and political economic dimensions of the platform. And that in doing so, for me, implicitly is in solidarity with the vulnerable peoples and lands and waters. And she cares about them in contrast to what she thinks, right? They, again, these big tech companies who are producing these technologies, that they don't care. And so for her, right, this is her ethical sense making in real time as she's mounting this critique. Stephanie agrees, but she sort of nuances her thinking a little bit here. And so Stephanie says, yeah, I think the same thing. I don't think ChatGPT, I don't think it's ethical. I think the company isn't ethical, but ChatGPT, like we were talking about ethics and then ethical life, and by itself, ChatGPT doesn't have morals to have ethics. But when you're used by a company and it kind of uses you in a way that it wants, they don't have good ethics, and ChatGPT can't be ethical. But is it helpful? I think it's pretty helpful, but it kind of does a lot more hurt than good. But I think as the years go on, there's going to be more things that it will help with, and then it's going to be harder to say, should we just shut it down, or should we keep using it? The more you use it, the more you get addicted to it. That's what I think. And so here we see, for me, this really interesting relationship that Stephanie is naming between the company and the technology. And we'll see her sort of pick this up later on. But she's, for me, sort of, if that relationship can be reimagined, that maybe then the technology for her can be considered ethical. At the same time, she's wrestling with the singularity versus solidarity, right? She's very forthright and then, yeah, I personally benefit from this technology. It helps me, but at what cost? And so we see her again wrestling with that. Yes, it's helpful for me personally, that singularity piece, but then, you know, if she thinks in solidarity with others who she's learned about are being exploited to train and maintain this technology, then all of a sudden the ethics of using this technology become much murkier. In this next excerpt, we see Chiara and Stephanie contemplate who should be held accountable for ChatGPT's impacts. So Chiara says, I think that if schools wanted to make ChatGPT available to students, they could, but it's not a problem. Like, I feel that's a government issue. If schools want to use it for good things, like not to help students cheat, but to help the teachers little, okay. But I don't think it's on the user. I think it's on the people who let it be, who let it affect people. And Stephanie says, so the schools should probably hold them accountable, or like the people, Chiara agrees, she says, yeah, Stephanie continues, who use it for a wider audience. We should probably hold these accountable, but it's kind of hard to hold these companies accountable at this time. I'm not sure why. And for me, I think this is important attention too of Chiara saying it's not on the user. I think often we see technologies deployed, released into the world, and then it's everybody else's problem, rather than the company themselves being held accountable and doing the kind of work ahead of time to think about what sort of guardrails need to be put on these technologies before they release them to corner the market and be the first to produce, in OpenAI's case, generative AI for a broad audience. And Stephanie picks up on that and is thinking about, well, then these companies should be held accountable, but she's not quite sure what that looks like. And I think that's an opportunity, as I'll talk about in the implications of the study. Finally, in this last excerpt, we see that Chiara conclusively asserts that ChatGPT is unethical because its harms outweigh benefits, while Stephanie, again, holds on to possibility. So Faith, the ambassador, returns to this question, okay, but is ChatGPT ethical? Stephanie sees her classmate's face, and they didn't know each other before this program. I'm seeing Chiara's face. She laughs, go first. And Chiara says, not at all. I'm sticking to my point. I don't think it's ethical at all. I think you can cover it up with trying to be helpful with the AI, but you're still doing more harm than good. So Faith says, yeah, is it really? Stephanie says, yeah, you know what? She exhales a lot over the course of the conversation, which to me just, I think, is an indication of this ethical wrestling is taking a physical toll on her. And she says, I know I said ChatGPT isn't ethical because it's not, but it's because of the companies. I solely blame the companies. I think ChatGPT, I think AI definitely has a place in the world. It can, we're using it right now. It can do recommendations for music, all that. ChatGPT, or specifically AI, has a place in the world. So again, we see her sort of conflating AI and generative AI here. But I think importantly, she gets back to this, can this relationship be reimagined between company and product? And Chiara, for me, is sort of picking up on this narrative of greenwashing, right? Of saying, look, this technology, these narratives are of good, and sort of papering over the problems or downplaying those problems. And then Stephanie continues, and she says, I think it's the companies, and I blame the companies. The companies are not ethical. I revoke my stance. I'm not giving them what was I saying? I'm not giving them a little space, okay? They are not ethical. The companies are not ethical. But ChatGPT, it's like a little baby. It can't even think for itself. So again, there's an exhalation. Maybe I'll exhale too. I'm going to say ChatGPT specifically is ethical, not the company. So basically, ChatGPT is still unethical. You're going to see her contradicting herself because the company kind of controls it. So that makes sense. And Chiara's like, mm-hmm. And so again, we see this contemplation and these sort of thinking through these relationships as these critiques are being mounted about the social, technical, and political economic dimensions, but those relationships between person and people and company and technology are really informing the kind of ethical sense making that those youth are participating in and sharing with the group. So in terms of sort of big takeaways of the study for me, one is that the focal youth here, Stephanie and Chiara, are philosophers of technology. They're embracing multiplicity, contingency, and complexity. In addition, right, we see that Chiara offers this holistic critical analysis, right? Her dress down of, right, they don't care, this like rhythmic critique that she has that's guided by a sense of injustice at big tech's abuse of people on the planet, right, to confidently proclaim that generative AI is unethical. And Stephanie, I think, aligns with Chiara. She's, emerges as critical of generative AI, finding that its environmental costs are particularly salient in her analysis. But she's drawn to the technology's possibilities, right? She says that, throughout the conversation, just showed you that one bit, that she finds this personally useful to her. And so she's wondering, can this relationship be reimagined between company, how the technology is developed and deployed, and the technology itself? So when we think about then, there's that. That's Stephanie. The implications for the study, one is that would argue we need more learning design of environments, of learning experiences that use ecological approaches for learning with, about, and against AI and generative AI, and equip young people with terms like greenwashing, effective altruism, long-termism, to be able to interrogate and understand the ideologies of a lot of these technologies. And that can be a part of a process of developing young people's critical technology consciousness. The other is develop civic education focused on AI governance, right? We see this question of accountability that Stephanie's like, we should hold them accountable. I don't really know what that would even look like. I will also say that I have no illusions under this current administration that big tech is going to be held accountable anytime soon. But there's an opportunity, and the literature points to an opportunity of civics education that's missing this sort of AI governance piece. And we think about that at the federal level, at the state level, at school levels. I think there's an opportunity there because, as Dr. Alondra Nelson says, that refusing to regulate AI is not an option. And then finally, thinking about this opportunity to seek and co-create alternative visions of AI. And so I think this is where we lead into Stephanie's wisdom, right? That and as someone who identifies as sort of a critical tech person, is that something I've learned from Dr. Ruha Benjamin is that we can dismantle oppressive systems, but we also then need to rebuild other worlds. And so there's a sort of growing body of work of AI researchers, developers, activists building these small-scale local AI systems that are grounded in decolonial, transfeminist, anti-racist, indigenous, decentralized, post-capitalist, and socio-environmental justice perspectives. And so I think if we listen to these young people and think about alternatives to big tech, that there's a lot of possibility there in thinking about how this technology might have a place in our present and into our future. That's the end of my study talk. I just want to spend a few minutes of my time thinking about what now. things aren't good. And so to make myself feel better the other day, I made this meme as I was doom scrolling. And so I just want to think about some and share some questions that I'm thinking about with the hope that maybe they'll resonate with some of you today too. And starting with, again, I mentioned Ruha Benjamin, and this quote from a recent book of hers that whether digging deep or sowing seeds far, I'm looking at that, but you aren't. Whether digging deep or sowing seeds far and wide, plotting is about questioning the scripts you've been handed and scheming with others to do and be otherwise for the collective good of all. So in the spirit of this quote, I want to share some questions and schemes with y'all. When I was last in Buffalo, and I don't know if, Chris, you saw I brought my ISLS water bottle. Thank you for that. And so one of the questions I've been thinking about in sort of my research program is, how do I develop a praxis grounded in sociocultural approaches to learning, Luddism, critical literacies and technology education, and climate justice education? That's a lot, but it's sort of my guiding lights at this point. As I mentioned, when I was here in June, I presented a paper that is in part about developing a Luddite praxis. And so very briefly, the Luddites, who are the Luddites? The Luddites were 19th century English cloth workers who targeted specific automating machines for destruction. They were not anti-technology, importantly, that they were against the concentration of power and capital in the hands of a few early industrialists. They were, in the language here of one of the original Luddites, fighting to put down all machinery hurtful to commonality. And again, as evidence continues to illuminate the intersections of AI and environmental racism, in this case, again, I think it's important that, at least for me, I'm asking myself, what might it look like to develop a praxis and program of research to put down the machinery hurtful to commonality? So that's one question I'm asking myself. Another question I'm asking myself is, how does my work resist and refuse capture by corporate and military interests? So the field of learning sciences and my home institution, has long been interested in AI and education. And I think it's important to understand and reckon with this history, which Chris has helped me to understand through his writing, including who's funding the work. And so importantly, this early paper was funded by Arthur Andersen Worldwide, which ended up collapsing because they provided accounting support for Enron, and DARPA, right, the military funding branch. And that AI research has long been funded by the US military. From 1956, when the AI was a term produced at the Dartmouth conference, to today. So a question that I'm asking myself is who is funding AI research, and do their values align with mine? Big tech was out and proud at Trump's inauguration, and they donated $1 million, I think, per head here, and well, in Elon Musk's case, much more than that, to the Trump campaign. And so for me, because if the funding landscape is dominated by big tech, then I'm concerned about how my work might be captured by powerful men who are aligned with our fascist president and the Nazi de facto president. And so I've been thinking about this paper by Meredith Whittaker. And Meredith Whittaker was a Google employee who quit and then went on to be the CEO of Signal, the encrypted messaging app. And so she describes this problematic funding environment as the steep cost of capture. And she writes in this piece from a few years ago that big tech's domination over the infrastructure of AI research and development extends beyond providing, quote, neutral platforms, that these companies control the tooling, development environments, languages, and software that define the AI research process. They make the water in which AI research swims. And this, to me, is an environment that we can see just last week. Right? OpenAI announces a $50 million of research funds. And so I read this initiative as OpenAI and Sam Altman's bid to capture research on AI in education, to steer dollars towards projects that ultimately benefit the company, its shareholders, over teachers, students, and their community. All is not lost. And so this is the work of an organization called Coding Rights. And so I'm learning from groups like Coding Rights about alternatives to the big tech monoculture. And I'm committed to scheming with community partners at local levels to consider how, if at all, AI might address a need from and within the community. And I think this work is in spirit of the learning sciences. So a quote that I keep coming back to from Joe Kernow and Susan Thoreau was from a special issue of the Journal of the Learning Sciences of Learning Collective Action. And they write in the opening to the special issue that we hope this issue encourages learning scientists to take the learning that happens through collective action seriously, to bring resources, financial, analytical, design-based, and feet in the street into relationships with activists, and to commit to engaging alongside movements so that the potential consequentiality of our work can be mobilized for social change through collective action. And finally, I wouldn't be staying true to my English teacher self and the images of trees in this presentation if I didn't share some poetry with you all. So I return to trees here, birch trees, these two lines from Robert Frost in his poem Birches. So Frost writes, "Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better." I've been reflecting on these lines at a time when powerful men are selling narratives of voyaging to Mars and beyond. And I reject their vision. Earth is the right place for love. So that's where I'm working from, here on these lands and these waters, from a place of love and despair and fury, today, tomorrow, and in years to come. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. Sorry to ask you to repeat something I'm sure you said, but what population did your sample, Stephanie and Tiara, come from? Like what age bracket? I know they're young people, but
yeah, they were 16 to 18 years old. Yeah.
So my response is, damn, those are some pretty informed and well-read young people, right? Like, so how did you get such informed participants? As the dad to two high schoolers myself, if I said, sit down, let's talk about the ethics of AI, they would give me some non-polite gesture and walk to the room and shut the door. So like how did you identify these people?
So, I mean, the recruitment process was we went to local high schools and through the Digital Youth Network and just advertised the program. So it was a self-selecting group who were interested in exploring the ethics of AI. In terms of their technical backgrounds, I don't know if many of them had, a deep knowledge of computer science. And it was really just that interest in thinking about the ethics of AI. And so that you saw that was on day 7. So I spent 6 days prior to that, talking about how does bias enter into AI, and we used there's the Google program. And again, I should say, like, I acknowledge, like, here's my Apple computer. I made this in Google Slides. Like, we make compromises. I should say I'm not sort of a purist up here. But we use a Google program, Teachable Machine, and using them, helping them to understand, like, here's how you train a data set, and here's how here's how personal bias might enter into the system. And then it was that audit that was what helped the young people understand those different social, technical, and political economic dimensions. But that was not like day 1, right? That was day 7. So there had been quite a bit of teaching up to that point. So don't be too hard on yourself.
Whew, thank you. All right.
Hi, my name is Naomi Smith Perrone. I am dually represented here. I work in the School of Management in the Global Programs Office, but I'm also a first-year PhD student in the Graduate School of Education. And I attended an AI session for the university here. And actually, I think I just divinely needed to be here today because we're looking at the implementation of curriculum that is going to address the needs of the students that are coming in. I, like you, also have a K through 12 background in English education, and asking these students what it is that they are already using the technology for and what they expect their degree to, how they expect their degree to serve them in this field, while also giving grounds to the ethical dilemmas that they will face in using this technology. So what would you, how would you say to replicate this? Obviously, these are 16 to 18-year-olds. If they do decide to pursue tertiary education, how could we do a replication-esque of getting students to inform professors and the faculty and the academy of what they want this technology to be for them and the generation that they are in?
Yeah, I mean, so I think having those conversations across disciplines is really important, and to meet people where they are. And so, I would love for every class to start with, a class or two about generative AI, because it does seem to be something that is impacting folks, whether you're a professor or you're a student. And then I mean, just talk about the approach that I've taken with undergraduates and thinking about, taught a class on AI equity in public education. And while I am sympathetic to policies that will not allow students to use generative AI, for us, it was like, I taught it with my advisor, Sapir Vakil, and like, we wanted the ethical wrestling to happen for each student. And so we asked them to, and again, I implicitly trust students, and I think it's important we do that, is that they then had to reflect on if they were using generative AI, how are they using it? And how did they determine that, because we were talking about all this stuff with undergraduates, how did they kind of reach the conclusion that it was okay to use it in that use case that they were using it for? And so for me, that's a start of like having that conversation, across disciplines, both from students and with faculty. And this is where it gets tricky though too. And you saw like Chiara talking about like, it can't be a the user can't be the sole, like arbiter of whether this technology is ethical, right? And so it's this sort of reproduction of, as I've started to think about it, of like big oil and the carbon footprint of like big oil produced the carbon footprint like as an idea to atomize responsibility for climate change. And so it's like, yes, I think we should ask individuals to wrestle with the ethical impacts of these technologies and the real, like, not in an abstract way, like in a very concrete way, but also then think about what mechanisms of corporate accountability can there be, or even like the narratives around the technologies, right? We were talking at breakfast earlier of like how these technologies are framed to students is really important too, right? If the narrative is these technologies are inevitable, everyone needs to be a prompt engineer or you won't get a job, then I think that's problematic because that narrative serves the tech companies first and foremost. Then you also have people who are recognizing this might be a bubble, and they're mounting evidence that the technology has cognitive impacts as well, in addition to the material planetary impacts. So I think there are lots of ways to go about it, and I think they're all worth pursuing.
Thank you so much for the talk and all your work on these issues. I think you spend some time talking about how many of kind of our understandings of the technology themselves are often kind of coded, pun intended, to the kids, right? I'm also wondering, what comes through with your talk is also kind of how our understanding of ethics itself is also kind of already coded in. And what I mean by that is the kids seem to have a very utilitarian view of ethics, which you say is this singularity versus solidarity. And like I'm wondering about that, A. And then the second part of my question is, although this seems like a really, really big thing, like ethics to me seems like a low bar, whereas like justice would seem as a much higher bar. And I'm just wondering if you see those things as different, and or if the kids or youth might see those as different. And really, that's an open question. I don't know.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tim. I mean, I think so. The first part of sort of ethics, I mean, I think it's importantly that singularity and solidarity, and I think that and is intentional. So I'm thinking about ethics not as a binary, but that there are trade-offs that we all make, and so I think that is what I'm thinking about. I think that ethics can then be sort of an entree into thinking about what does justice look like in these systems, right? And so questions of accountability, right, is that if I individually, want to live an ethical life, what does it mean for me to use this technology? But then if I want to, collective movements of justice towards these technology companies being held accountable for the damages that they're doing, I think we can think about building on that sort of ethical discussion to then imagine what it would look like to achieve justice both individually for lands and waters, for the companies themselves.
So, thank you. I struggle sometimes with the ebb and flow between industry, government, and universities as the nexus for technology innovation. So once upon a time, like that JLS excerpt you had, you needed government-sized money and academic-sized expertise to do AI.
Yeah.
And then, at some point, now we're in a position where the models take the kind of money and infrastructure that is primarily coming from venture capital, although also national governments like the government of China. And I wonder, what your thoughts are, less on training undergrads to think about the AI and thinking of us as learners or members of society. And, what are your thoughts on the specific role or relationships that universities can play in figuring out, what that water Meredith Whittaker is talking about is?
Yeah.
Because at some level, all the people who work at the big AI companies have deep ties to university programs that they have come from or that they fund directly to give them research capacity.
Yeah.
And then, apart from like running models and having server farms and all that kind of stuff, there are not only human resource issues, but kind of idea, patents, conceptual issues that go back and forth between higher ed and everybody else. And I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, so I think about work of like Timnit Gebru and thinking about her distributed AI research group and thinking about what does it look like to sort of have distributed networks of whether it's compute power, but also sort of those critiques of justice that Tim was talking about. And then as university-based researchers, what does it look like to partner with local organizations or other companies that are building those small-scale models? So, for me, the one example that I know best comes from New Zealand and an organization called Te Huka Media that has built a small language revitalization AI model that was used for Maori people and revitalization of Maori language. And it's centered around Maori cultural practices of data sovereignty. It does have an environmental footprint, but it's much smaller compared to OpenAI's or Microsoft. And so that is an area of research that I'm really interested in exploring of like what would sort of research practice partnership look like with these small organizations that universities who have the sort of resources can provide in conjunction with these smaller community-based organizations that might bypass the kind of current steep cost of capture that Whittaker is talking about. I just don't know enough about it, and so that's one of my own curiosities as well.
How many people feel like this talk made them think?
All right, my job is done. All right, thanks everybody.